The relentless heat of South Carolina weighed down on the land, heavy as a blanket, suffocating everything beneath it. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the acrid dust that rose from the plantation grounds. Even the wind, when it did blow, was no relief, just a stifling gust that stirred the heat, carrying with it the distant hum of flies, the clinking of chains, and the murmur of discontent. The fields, with their rows of cotton bending beneath the weight of the plants, looked like endless waves in a sea of green, but this was no ocean. This was a land of oppression, a place where the cries of the enslaved were swallowed by the vast emptiness of the fields. John Carter stood in the shadow of the barn, his broad shoulders and muscular frame outlined against the backdrop of a cloudless sky. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the heat shimmered in the distance, blurring the line between earth and sky. The barn loomed behind him, dark and imposing, a symbol of the years of suffering he and his fellow stable hands had endured. The building creaked in the still air, as if the walls themselves whispered the secrets of the land, secrets of cruelty, betrayal, and unspoken rage. John's hands, calloused and rough, clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. His heart beat with a steady rhythm, a pulse that matched the sweat dripping down his brow. The weight of what he was about to do pressed on him like the oppressive air. The plan was set. The time had come. But the cost, oh, the cost, was something he had to bear. The fire that would consume everything was something he couldn't control, and even as he stood here, in the relative safety of the barn's shadow, the flame had already begun to burn in his chest. Footsteps in the dust behind him interrupted his thoughts. He turned slightly, his gaze narrowing. It was Sarah Hawthorne, her fiery red hair blazing against the sun's heat, her posture straight and unyielding as always. She was young, barely into her 20s, but there was a hard edge to her features that betrayed her years of hardship. The sweat on her brow matched his own, but her eyes were filled with a fire that could burn just as hot as the sun itself. John said nothing as she drew closer, his silence speaking volumes. He didn't need words. They had been through too much, seen too much. She knew exactly what he was thinking. He could see it in her eyes, the same mixture of resolve and uncertainty. They were bound together by their pain, their fury, and the shared vision of what they had planned. The weight of their people's suffering was a chain that shackled them both, but it was a chain that had to be broken. "Is it time?" Sarah asked, her voice low, as though speaking any louder might shatter the fragile tension in the air. John nodded, his eyes never leaving the barn. He could hear the faint cries of the workers in the fields, the slapping of whips, the shouts of their masters. They were oblivious. The Hawthornes, Colonel Jacob and his spoiled daughter, Rebecca, thought they were untouchable. They were blind to the storm gathering at their doorstep. "They'll never see it coming," John muttered, though the words felt hollow as they left his lips. He had spent years in the stables, enduring the sting of the lash, the degradation, the humiliation. He had watched as the masters laughed, drank, and played at their ease, while his people bled in the fields and toiled in silence. "They think we're animals, John," Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "They think we're nothing. But we're not. We never were." Her words had a weight to them, a defiance that was as much a fire inside her as the one that would soon ignite the barn. She was right, of course. The Hawthornes had always treated them like beasts, but the time had come for that to end. John's jaw clenched. He could see Colonel Hawthorne now, standing in the distance near the main house, his hands resting on the polished handle of a riding crop. He wore that look of smug satisfaction, the one that came with knowing he held dominion over everything his eyes touched. He never looked over at the stables, never acknowledged the people who made his life easier with their labor. That was the way of it. The way of all masters. Rebecca was with him, of course. Always by his side, a princess in a world she believed to be her own. She would laugh if she knew what was coming. She would scoff at the thought of a rebellion. She had never known true fear, true hunger, true suffering. All she knew was luxury and arrogance. "The fire won't just burn the barn, will it?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but filled with a quiet dread. John glanced at her, his gaze flicking to her hand, which she kept tightly wrapped around the wooden handle of a sickle. It was a tool of her trade, but today, it was a weapon. "It'll burn everything," he said, his voice softer now. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was there. Once the fire started, there would be no stopping it. Just as there would be no stopping the consequences of their actions. Sarah's eyes hardened. "They've taken everything from us, John. Our families. Our dignity. Our lives." John nodded, the bitterness in his mouth as real as the sweat on his skin. "We owe them nothing but this." The tension between them thickened as they stood there, facing the reality of their decision. They were about to strike a blow that would change everything, and though the revenge was sweet in its justice, the price was steep. Neither one of them could be sure what would come after. Would they finally find freedom, or would they be consumed by the flames of their own rage? In the distance, the sound of Colonel Hawthorne's voice reached them. It was loud, commanding, barking orders at his men, his voice thick with authority. Rebecca's laugh followed, high and dismissive, like the flutter of a bird's wings before it flies away. The two of them were so sure of their place in the world. They had no idea how close they were to losing everything. John turned back toward Sarah, his eyes narrowing. "Tonight, it ends." She nodded, and for a moment, they stood together in the shadow of the barn, silent but united. Their revenge was not just for them, it was for everyone who had suffered in silence, for everyone who had been broken by the cruelty of men who saw them as less than human. The time for suffering was over. Feeling the heat of this tension? Comment below on how you think the enslaved will strike back. The days on the plantation dragged on, each one bleeding into the next with a monotonous cruelty that seemed to suffocate the spirit of all who lived there. The sun, merciless in its intensity, cast a golden haze over the vast expanse of cotton fields that stretched endlessly in every direction. The low hum of cicadas was a constant, as if the very earth beneath them groaned under the weight of its own injustice. Every inch of land here had been soaked in sweat, blood, and tears, some of them long since dried, but the pain still lingered, embedded deep in the soil. John Carter's mornings were always the same. He rose before dawn, his back aching from years of hard labor. His mind, too, felt heavy, clouded by thoughts of the plan that was soon to be set into motion. He could feel the weight of it, the responsibility, the consequences of what he was about to do. Yet there was no other choice. The time had come for justice to be meted out, for revenge to be seized. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the plantation, John made his way to the stable, where he would begin his day's work. The horses he tended to were a small comfort in a world that seemed set on breaking him. He would spend hours grooming and feeding them, the only moments in his day when his mind could quiet, if only for a brief while. But even in these quiet moments, the images of what lay ahead loomed in his mind: burning barns, cries of fear and rage, the irreversible cost of his actions. Today was no different. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of hay and sweat mixing with the smell of impending storm. The stable hands moved with purpose, each one aware of the role they would soon play in the coming rebellion. Some were eager, their eyes alight with a quiet excitement. Others were hesitant, the weight of the plan causing their shoulders to sag. But all of them knew that this was the only way forward. The only way to take back their dignity. John paused as he walked past the horse stalls, his eyes locking with those of his fellow stable hands. Each of them bore the marks of a lifetime spent in servitude, hands cracked and rough, backs hunched from toil, faces lined with weariness. But there was something else in their eyes now, something that had been missing for so long. Hope. A glimmer of it, flickering in the shadows of their fears. "John," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see Sarah Hawthorne approaching, her fiery red hair pulled back into a tight braid, her expression set with determination. Her eyes, though, were clouded with the same uncertainty that plagued him. They had both known that the act of rebellion was inevitable, but the closer they came to it, the more it seemed like an impossible task. To kill their masters, to set fire to their world, it was a burden neither of them had ever wanted to bear. But it was the only path to freedom. "The master's at it again," Sarah said, her voice low and tight with controlled anger. "He's got Colonel Hawthorne out there yelling at the workers." His voice, she broke off, shaking her head, "I can't stand it, John. I can't. He thinks we're nothing." John's jaw clenched at the mention of Colonel Hawthorne. He could see him now, standing on the porch of the grand plantation house, his hands on his hips, barking orders at the men and women who labored under the hot sun. The colonel was a tall man, broad-shouldered and strong, but there was nothing noble about him. He carried himself with an air of entitlement, as though the land and the people who worked it were his by divine right. His arrogance seeped into everything he did, from the way he treated the enslaved to the way he spoke of them. "He has to pay for what he's done," Sarah continued, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "They all do." John didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the figure of Colonel Hawthorne in the distance, his figure outlined against the rising sun. The man's smug, superior stance made John's blood boil. He had seen it all before, seen the way the colonel treated his people like animals, demanding their sweat, their lives, while giving nothing in return. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, "They all do." But revenge, John knew, was not something to be taken lightly. To kill the colonel, to lock him inside that barn, there was no going back from that. And yet, as much as he wanted to turn away from the plan, as much as he wanted to ignore the fire that raged inside him, he knew it was the only way. The only way to make them feel what they had made him and his people feel for so long. "I know," John said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of what was coming. "But we can't let fear hold us back now. If we wait any longer, nothing will change. We've waited too long as it is." Sarah nodded, her eyes steady with resolve. She had known the price of rebellion longer than anyone. Her family had been torn apart by the Hawthornes, and the fire of vengeance that burned in her heart was something that could never be extinguished. She would not rest until justice had been served. As they spoke, the sound of Colonel Hawthorne's voice reached them again, sharp and demanding. It was the same voice that had cracked the whip over their backs for years, the same voice that had stolen their families, their homes, their very souls. The anger bubbled up inside John, and for a moment, he felt as though he might explode. He had lived his life with a calmness that betrayed the storms brewing within him, but now, that calmness seemed like a distant memory. The rage inside him was too strong to ignore. "We do this for them," Sarah said, breaking his thoughts again. "For every person who's ever been broken by them." John looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. There was no more hesitation in Sarah's gaze. The time had come. There was no more room for fear. "Tonight, we burn them," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. What would you do if you were in Sarah or John's shoes? Drop a comment and let us know. The day stretched long, and as the oppressive heat continued to smother the plantation, the stable hands worked in quiet synchrony, their movements deliberate but unhurried. Each task, grooming horses, mending fences, moving hay, was an act of preparation. But in their hearts, the true work was already underway. John Carter and Sarah Hawthorne had orchestrated a rebellion that was as much a silent promise as it was a deadly strike. There was no turning back now. The plan had been set into motion, and all they had to do was wait for the moment when the fire would finally consume everything. John stood at the edge of the stable, staring out toward the barn that loomed on the far side of the grounds. Its dark, weathered boards stood like a testament to years of suffering, a place where the cracks in the foundation had witnessed cruelty, pain, and the weight of countless broken spirits. It was to be the place of reckoning, the stage for the last act of defiance. The fire would erase the past, but it would also mark the beginning of something new, something terrifying. John could feel the burn of the flames already, hot on the back of his neck. The stable was silent except for the quiet snorts of the horses and the distant clink of chains. There was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the humidity. It was the weight of anticipation, the quiet hum of the plan that stretched out like a taut rope, ready to snap. As the sun sank lower in the sky, the air grew thicker, heavy with the knowledge of what was about to happen. John felt Sarah approach him before he saw her. Her footsteps were familiar, quick and deliberate, yet carrying the same subtle weight that every enslaved person had learned to carry with them. It was the weight of survival, of sacrifice. As she came to stand beside him, he didn't need to look at her to know that she was feeling the same tension, the same dread. They had talked about this moment countless times. The plan was clear. But nothing could prepare them for the finality of it. "You've spoken to the others?" John asked, his voice low but steady. Sarah nodded, her hands resting on the worn leather handle of her sickle. "They're ready. Everyone knows their part. We'll strike after dark, when the light's gone. We can't risk being seen." John knew the importance of timing. The darkness would offer them the cover they needed. But even with that, they had only one shot. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for them, but for everyone. The Hawthorns would retaliate with brutal force. Yet, there was no choice but to go through with it. "They won't expect it," John said, his words filled with a quiet bitterness. "They've never had to fear us. They think we're nothing but tools to them. They've forgotten who we are." Sarah's face hardened, her jaw set with an intensity that mirrored John's own resolve. "They'll remember tonight. They'll remember that we're not their property. That we never were." Together, they turned toward the stable doors, their bodies moving with the same steady rhythm as the others who worked in silence alongside them. Every movement felt weighted with purpose. Each task was not just about getting through the day, it was about preparing for the night that would change everything. Inside the stable, the rest of the hands were gathered, all of them speaking in hushed tones, their faces grim but determined. They were ready. They had been preparing for this moment for years, and now the final piece was falling into place. One of the men, a quiet giant named Samuel, stepped forward, his rough hands folded in front of him. "The fire will be ready," he said, his voice deep but calm. "We've got the hay, the oil, everything. It won't take long to light it up." John nodded. "Good. But we can't risk them getting out. The barn's old. The walls are brittle. It won't take long for the fire to spread. Once we lock them in, we have to be sure they don't get away." Sarah's eyes flashed with an intensity that sent a shiver down John's spine. "We won't give them a chance." There was a quiet resolve in the air now, a shared understanding among the stable hands. They knew what they were about to do was irrevocable. They weren't just taking back their lives, they were burning down everything that had held them captive. The chains of their bondage were long since broken in their hearts, but tonight, they would make it real. They would watch as the world they had known turned to ash. John turned to face Sarah once more, his eyes meeting hers. The weight of the plan had never felt heavier, but it was also the first time in years that he could see a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She was as determined as he was, perhaps even more so. She had lost her family to the Hawthorns, a victim of their cruelty. There was no going back for her. This was justice. This was freedom. "We've come this far," he said quietly. "Tonight, we will finish it." The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the fields, painting everything in the deep orange and purple hues of twilight. The air grew cooler as the evening breeze began to stir, but the heat of the day lingered, like the last traces of a nightmare that refused to fade. As darkness crept in, the stable hands began to gather their tools, torches, ropes, and the small but lethal instruments they would need. Every movement was purposeful, deliberate. No one spoke unless necessary, and even then, their words were clipped, like the ticking of a clock counting down to an inevitable end. They were walking toward their fate, their hearts thundering in their chests, but they did not falter. John and Sarah took their positions, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the Hawthorns' arrival. The hours seemed to stretch on forever, but at last, the signal came. A figure, cloaked in shadow, appeared at the far end of the plantation, Colonel Hawthorne. His silhouette was unmistakable, tall and proud, his posture that of a man who thought himself invincible. He was walking toward the barn, his face set in the same arrogant expression that had driven John to the brink of rebellion. Now, there was no turning back. As the plan takes shape, what do you think the final moments will hold? Comment your thoughts. The night had fallen like a heavy shroud, enveloping the plantation in darkness. The distant calls of night creatures filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence that hung heavily over the stable. The world felt still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. The oppressive heat of the day had given way to the cooler, more dangerous air of nightfall. The moon, hanging low and full in the sky, cast long shadows over the land, its light distant, almost indifferent to the violence about to erupt beneath it. John stood at the edge of the barn, the cool night air biting at his skin, but the heat within him still simmered. He could feel the fire inside, not just the flames they had prepared to set, but the righteous fury that had built up in his chest for so long. His breath was shallow, every inhale filling his lungs with the tension that wrapped itself around his body like a vice. This was the moment. The moment that would bring down everything, their suffering, their silence, and the unrelenting cruelty of the Hawthornes. The barn, once a place of forced labor and humiliation, would soon be a tomb. Sarah was beside him, her fiery hair wild in the wind, her eyes fierce and unyielding. She glanced over at him, her gaze steely, a wordless understanding passing between them. There was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. This was the night they would either change the course of their lives or meet their own end. In the distance, the silhouette of Colonel Jacob Hawthorne loomed, a dark figure striding toward the barn. His tall, broad frame was unmistakable, his posture stiff and regal, as if nothing in this world could ever touch him. Behind him, his spoiled daughter, Rebecca, sauntered, her head held high, her every step a silent declaration of her perceived superiority. The sound of their footsteps was the only sound that pierced the night, sharp and deliberate. John's grip tightened around the handle of the sickle at his side. He had seen the colonel many times before, strutting around like a king in his own domain, dismissing the people he ruled over with nothing more than contempt. But tonight, that reign would come to an end. The colonel's arrogance, his cruelty, would be repaid in full. The time for judgment had arrived. As the colonel and his daughter approached the barn, they did not notice the figures that moved like shadows in the darkness, circling quietly, ready to strike. The stable hands, though hidden from sight, were positioned perfectly, each one in place, their eyes fixed on the two figures who had never known anything but control. Tonight, John whispered to Sarah, his voice low but filled with a sense of finality, "We make them see what they've done." Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. "They won't escape this time." The colonel reached the barn first, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he stood before the heavy, wooden doors. Rebecca, with her disdainful smile, came to stand beside him, her fingers tapping against the side of her riding crop. The arrogance in her expression was clear, she thought this would be just another night, just another set of orders to give. She had no idea what waited for them inside. Colonel Hawthorne pulled open the barn door with a slow, deliberate motion. The hinges groaned in protest, but the sound was lost in the wind. Inside, the faint scent of hay and old wood clung to the air, mingling with the darker, more foreboding scent of what was about to happen. The colonel stepped inside, his back straight, his face a mask of superiority, unaware that he was walking into his own judgment. Behind him, Rebecca followed, her head tilted slightly, as though she were merely indulging in another of her father's whims. John's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the pressure building, the moment growing closer. As the colonel and his daughter entered the barn, Sarah moved swiftly, her footsteps silent against the dirt. The trap was set. In the blink of an eye, the barn door slammed shut behind them. The sound was deafening, a heavy thud that echoed in the silence of the night. Rebecca's sharp gasp was the first sign that they realized something was wrong. Colonel Hawthorne whirled around, his face contorting in confusion, his eyes narrowing as he searched the darkness for the source of the sudden noise. "Who's there?" The colonel's voice rang out, harsh and demanding. He took a step back toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle, but it was too late. From the shadows, a rope snaked out, catching the door and binding it shut. The colonel's eyes widened in disbelief as the weight of the situation began to dawn on him. Rebecca let out a soft, indignant cry, but it was smothered almost immediately by the quick, efficient movement of the stable hands. They had positioned themselves perfectly, surrounding the barn in the cover of darkness. John stepped forward, his shadow blending into the night. His face was set in grim determination, his eyes locked onto the colonel. This was the moment. There would be no more waiting. No more fear. No more submission. Colonel Hawthorne, John's voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Your time has come. The colonel, for the first time in his life, seemed to falter. His arrogance, his unshakable belief in his invincibility, faltered for just a moment. He glanced at Rebecca, who was frozen beside him, her face pale and full of confusion. What is this? The colonel's voice was edged with panic now, though he tried to maintain control. Who dares? You dared, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like the strike of a whip. She stepped forward, her figure emerging from the shadows like a ghost, her eyes fierce with the fire of her purpose. You dared to think you could break us. But you never understood what we were. What we are. And tonight, you'll learn what happens when you push us too far. Rebecca stepped back, her eyes wide with fear now. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She was trembling, her sense of entitlement shattering in the face of the inevitable. John turned back to the colonel, his heart steady now, his resolve unshakable. The time for negotiation was over. The time for action had come. He nodded to the stable hands, and in that moment, the barn became their courtroom, the flames that would soon consume it their sentence. Tonight, John said, his voice rising with the power of truth, we take back what you stole from us. We take back our lives. The flames rise higher, how will this end for the masters? Let us know what you think. The fire began to crackle softly, its low hum a sinister symphony that echoed through the barn. The first spark had been lit, and now the flames stretched hungrily toward the hay, the oil-soaked wood, the very bones of the structure. They moved with terrifying speed, twisting and reaching, hungry for the remains of everything that had once been, everything that had held them captive for so long. The barn was no longer just a building, it was a symbol, a living, breathing monument to the cruelty they had suffered. And now, it was going to burn. Inside the barn, the air grew thick with heat, the oppressive warmth pushing down on the bodies of Colonel Hawthorne and his daughter, Rebecca. Their eyes were wide with terror, the smoke already stinging their lungs, their senses dulled by the growing haze. The thick black clouds of smoke swirled above them, choking off any chance of escape, any hope of reprieve. The colonel's hand trembled as he grasped the door, trying in vain to pry it open, but it was locked tight, locked by the hands that had known nothing but suffering for too long. Open the door. Rebecca screamed, her voice high-pitched and panicked. She pounded on the wooden panels, her fists weak against the sturdy wood. Father! Help me! We need to get out. Her voice cracked with fear, but Colonel Hawthorne, his face flushed red with rage, ignored her, his eyes searching the corners of the barn, looking for some way out. His years of dominance, his belief in his own invincibility, now seemed like a cruel joke. He had always thought himself untouchable, but now, as the flames began to lick at the wooden beams above him, he was nothing more than a trapped animal. Damn them! The colonel bellowed, his voice shaking with fury and desperation. I'll have them whipped. I'll have them hanged. Open this door now. But the sound of his fury was drowned out by the crackling of the fire, the roar of the flames growing louder as they fed on the dry wood. The heat was unbearable now, the walls of the barn groaning in protest as they were consumed. The air grew thick with smoke, and it was hard to tell where the flames began and the darkness ended. John stood just outside the barn, his back against the wooden wall, watching the chaos unfold through a small crack in the door. His heart hammered in his chest, the sound of the fire matching the pounding of his pulse. He could hear the colonel's voice, the desperation in it, but he felt no sympathy. Not anymore. The man who had stood on the backs of so many for so long, the man who had treated them like animals, was finally facing the reckoning he had long deserved. "This is justice," John whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. He had imagined this moment so many times, had dreamed of it in the dark of the night, when the pain and the rage were too much to bear. But now that it was happening, now that the flames were consuming everything he had hated, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had been lost. The weight of their actions pressed down on him like the very heat that poured from the barn. Behind him, Sarah moved silently, her face set in stone, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The fire had become their ally now, burning away the remnants of their old lives, their old selves. But as the flames rose higher, she could feel it too, the cost of what they had done. Revenge was a dangerous thing. It consumed you, even when you thought you were in control. "We've done it," Sarah said softly, her voice almost drowned by the roar of the fire. "It's done." John turned to her, his gaze heavy. "Is it enough?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Was it enough? Was this all there was to freedom, this violence, this destruction? Was this the price they had to pay to finally take back their lives? The question echoed in his mind, gnawing at him, but there was no easy answer. What had been taken from them could never be fully restored, and no matter how much revenge they sought, it could never fill the emptiness left by years of suffering. Inside the barn, the colonel's cries became frantic, his voice cracking with fear. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "You can't burn us alive." Rebecca was sobbing beside him, her face streaked with tears, her hands grasping at the wooden slats of the barn door in a futile attempt to escape. Her once pristine dress was torn and stained, her luxurious appearance now reduced to nothing more than a helpless woman, desperate to survive. But there would be no saving them. The moment the door had slammed shut, their fate had been sealed. They were trapped inside the flames, just as they had trapped so many others outside. John's thoughts turned cold as he listened to their cries. He had heard the same desperation in the voices of his people, begging for mercy that would never come. He had heard the same pleas for life, the same cries for justice that were always ignored. Tonight, those voices were being answered. Tonight, they were reclaiming their right to be heard. But as the barn burned, he could not ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he felt a weight he hadn't expected. The fire might have consumed the colonel and his daughter, but it would not cleanse him of the guilt that gnawed at his soul. "We can't turn back now," Sarah said, her voice pulling him back to the present. She stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing as she watched the flames devour the barn. "We did what we had to do." John nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the flames. The fire was their victory, their justice, but at what cost? As the barn continued to burn, the cries of the colonel and Rebecca faded into the night, consumed by the sound of crackling wood and the rising wind. The fire would burn until nothing remained. The only thing left behind would be ashes, and the uncertain future of those who had sparked the flame. What price does revenge truly cost? Comment below on how the characters might move forward. The fire had long since consumed the barn, leaving only the blackened remnants of its frame behind. The smoke still lingered in the air, a thick haze that choked the sky and stained the earth beneath it. The night had fallen into an uneasy silence, the kind that follows destruction, when the world holds its breath, unsure of what will come next. The flames that had once roared with the fury of justice were now dying embers, flickering weakly in the dark like the last vestiges of a long and bloody battle. John stood at the edge of the charred remains, his eyes fixed on the smoking ruins. His body felt heavy, drained by the toll of what they had done. The fire had been swift, its rage uncontested, but now it was over. The colonel and his daughter were nothing more than ashes in the wind. The rebellion was complete. But with the victory came the aftermath. Sarah was beside him, her face illuminated by the glow of the dying fire. Her eyes were fixed on the same ruin, but there was something in her expression, something deeper than satisfaction or relief. It was the look of someone who had crossed a line, and now, there was no way back. She had fought for this. She had wanted this. But now that it was done, what remained? What was the price of this victory? "It's done," she said, her voice quiet, almost hollow. She didn't need to say more. They both knew what had been lost in the flames. John nodded, his gaze unwavering. The fire had taken everything, burned away the sins of the past, consumed the cruelty of the Hawthornes, but what was left for them? Could they ever return to the life they had before? Or had they, like the barn, been reduced to ash, with nothing but the faint trace of who they used to be? "There's no turning back now," John muttered, more to himself than to her. "We've crossed the line. There's no going back to who we were." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her fingers tightened around the sickle at her side, the metal reflecting the flickering light of the fire. She was a warrior, but even warriors feel the weight of their actions. "We were never meant to go back," she finally said, her voice hardening. "There was never a way back. Not for us. Not for them." John turned his gaze toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what now, Sarah? What now that the world we knew is gone? What happens after the flames burn out?" She stepped closer to him, her eyes fierce with a conviction that had always driven her. "We live. We fight. We will make sure this never happens again." The wind picked up, stirring the ash from the smoldering remains of the barn and sending it swirling through the night air. The smell of burnt wood still clung to everything, clung to them. But it wasn't just the smoke from the barn. It was the weight of everything that had come before, the stench of a world they had just upended. There was no easy way to move forward after what they had done. There was no joy in the flames, no celebration in the ruins. All they had left now was each other, and the uncertain road ahead. Behind them, the rest of the stable hands emerged from the shadows, their faces marked by the same tension that gripped Sarah and John. Some of them wore expressions of quiet relief, others had the look of soldiers after a battle, exhausted, but still standing. They had seen the fire burn, and they had participated in the destruction. But now, as the night began to settle, they realized that the hardest part had yet to come. "We did what we had to do," Samuel said, his deep voice breaking the silence. He stepped forward, his broad shoulders heavy with the burden of the night's work. "But we can't just walk away from this. Not like this." John turned to him, his face hardening. "What else is there to do, Samuel? The Hawthornes are gone. The plantation is ours now." Samuel shook his head, his face drawn with the weight of the truth. "The plantation's ours, sure. But so what? What does that mean, exactly? What does a world without them look like?" "You're right. There's no going back. But what comes after this? Who are we now?" John felt the sting of Samuel's words. They were true. They had burned the Hawthornes down, yes, but what had they built in its place? The land was free of their cruelty, but it was also free of anything else. There was no plan for what came next, no vision for a future beyond the rebellion. They had burned the barn, but in doing so, they had burned down the world they knew. There was nothing left to hold on to. "Maybe it's not about what's next," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Maybe it's about what we leave behind. The fire wasn't just for us. It was for everyone who came before us. Everyone who never had a chance to fight back." John turned his gaze back to the ruins of the barn. The last of the flames were dying now, leaving only the smell of smoke and the faint sound of crackling embers. The Colonel and Rebecca Hawthorne were gone, but their legacy, of cruelty, of suffering, would live on in the hearts of those who had survived. "There's always a price," John murmured. We've paid for it, but it doesn't feel like we've won. I thought it would feel different. Because it's not over yet, Sarah replied. This is just the beginning. The world might be different, but we're not done. We've only just started. John nodded slowly, understanding now. The fire had changed everything, but it had also given them something. A new beginning, perhaps. It was up to them to decide what that would look like. The land was free, but they were the ones who had to fill it with something worth fighting for. As the last of the embers died and the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the stable hands gathered around John and Sarah, their faces marked by exhaustion, but also something else. A quiet, burning resolve. They had done what was necessary. Now, they would rebuild. Together. The story ends, but the consequences linger. Subscribe for more tales of dark justice.